Hey everybody, Eric Trexler here with the Mass Research Review. This is Mass Office Hours Live, and this week I am joined by the legend, Dr. Eric Helms. Helms, how you doing?
Trexler, I'm doing very well. Thank you very much. It is always an honor and a privilege, and thank you to everyone for joining us.
Yeah, we even had a few people that got here early. They were camped out virtually on YouTube, like at a big event where you sleep there overnight to be the first one in the gates. So yeah, should have a nice crowd tonight in the live YouTube chat. If you like what we're doing here, we're now on episode 19, believe it or not. We've been chugging along. If you like what we're doing and you want to support us, there's actually many ways you could do that. So for example, one thing that you could do is you could like, rate, or subscribe wherever you get this video presentation / podcast. So if you're watching on YouTube, hit the like. If you're getting this later on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, whatever, make sure you like it and subscribe and review and all that stuff. And if you're going to leave a review while you're at it, you might as well leave a good one, right, Helms? That's typically what people do, and we certainly appreciate that. Yeah, 5 stars is a common recommendation. You could also tell a friend, spread the good news, let people know what we're doing here so that they can join in on the fun. If you want to submit questions for us to answer in a future episode, there's a link in the description of this video. Hit that link anytime you want, 24/7. Submit a question there. We'll try to get to it as best we can. But one of the best ways to get your question answered on the show is to join us live in the YouTube chat. We go live every Wednesday night, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Helms, what time is that in New Zealand?
Depends on the time of year. Currently, it's 1 p.m. on Thursday, the day after in the future.
There you go. So wherever that fits with your time zone, be sure to join us live. And we love seeing people in the chat and hanging out with everybody. So that's all I've got in terms of housekeeping notes. What do you say we get into some questions, Helms?
I couldn't imagine anything I'd want to do more.
All right. I want to start out by lobbing you a big softball, just putting one right over the plate. Okay. And the reason I say that is you are one of the few people in the universe who has actually done a study directly addressing this question. So I feel like if you were even remotely awake and lucid during the preparation of that paper, then this should be an easy one for you. So we had a question. It's addressed to Eric, which I got a kick out of because I genuinely don't know who if it was supposed to be you or me. So one of us had once told this individual that a small surplus, 100 calories or so, over a longer time frame, generally yields better hypertrophy results for trainees. Is that surplus, that level of surplus, still advisable, taking into account the more recent literature? So if someone wants to maximize their hypertrophy, should they have a caloric surplus? And if so, how big are we talking?
And it could have legitimately been either one of us, because we have written about this in, I think, 2 different narrative reviews around bodybuilding recommendations.
Yeah.
Or at least one. And then I also wrote about it in the one I did with Slater. And then I know we've both written about the tortoise versus the hare analogy to gaining and losing, and referred to one another's work in mass. And then, of course, the recent research that I think they're probably referring to, I was actually the lead author on. So I will say that strictly what I may have said or what is possibly interpreted or the actual outcome is I don't actually think a 100 calorie surplus is better than a 200 or a 50 calorie surplus or a 1,000 calorie surplus for actual muscle gain from just like a straight up black and white answer, mechanistic, like if we chucked them in a DEXA scan and a year from now, who gained more lean mass? That would probably scale a little bit with just total calorie surplus, because there's an obligatory gain in lean mass, even when you gain body fat, because adipose tissue is not purely triglyceride. So with that out of the way, I will say that to the best of our knowledge, as we understand it right now, it is the absence of a deficit and the presence of a surplus, which probably allows you to maximize the rate of muscle gain. And then the instances where a larger surplus would be better are when you have the capacity to gain muscle mass at a faster rate. And I think the best way I like to present this data is by starting with the untrained young male who is just getting into lifting. And that was represented very well by a study by Rosnick and colleagues, where they had 3 groups. One group eating their habitual diet, and then 2 groups eating their habitual diet plus essentially a weight gainer supplement, and then tracking them for 8 weeks while doing resistance training and looking at changes in body composition and body mass. And the 2 groups that were doing essentially the weight gainer, they're eating 2,000 calories on top of their habitual diet, or at least that's what they were prescribed. This wasn't a metabolic ward study, so I suspect they probably ate a little bit less than their habitual diet. One of those groups having that be a protein-containing weight gainer, so they up their protein intake. The other group just basically taking in maltodextrin. And in both groups, whether they're adding just 2,000 calories of carbs to their habitual diet or a mixed intake of supplemental protein powder and carbohydrate powder, they gained roughly 3 kilos of lean mass and 3 kilos of body mass over those 8 weeks, meaning that they were gaining almost a full pound a week every week that consisted almost entirely of lean mass. And I think many of us remember the good old days where that was possible, and the brief window where we thought, oh my God, bulking is the answer. And maybe we did not have the same experience the other times we went to the well. So if you were described by that sample and that population where you have just started lifting weights, you're young, and you are, bright-eyed, and you've got a lot of gains to make on the table, you would probably be doing yourself a bit of a disservice only eating a 100-calorie surplus. You would probably experience more body recomposition in such an instance if you did, but there is some just rate limiters if you're in too small of a surplus that just doesn't allow your body to synthesize tissue at the rate it possibly could if you've got quote-unquote decent genetics and you're trying to put on muscle mass. So yeah, novices gaining muscle mass for the first time, or people who've maybe been restricted for a long period of time while lifting and their body's been kind of held back from making those initial gains, you would probably do better on a higher than 100-calorie surplus. However, for people who are in the post-novice stage, where they've put on at least that first big old chunk of muscle mass that they get seemingly just by looking at weights and opening the fridge at all, it does seem that larger surpluses don't really provide much of an advantage. And if they do, it is very small. The most recent research that we did, we compared 3 different groups, one that was prescribed maintenance intake, one that was prescribed a 5% surplus, one that was prescribed a 15% surplus. But then in reality, what we found was that those prescriptions resulted in varied body mass gains. So we did an entire sample level regression analysis using a Bayesian model looking at changes in skin fold thicknesses, 1RM strength on the bench and squat, and then ultrasound muscle thickness changes at the triceps, biceps, and quadriceps. And we saw the strongest relationship by far between skin fold thickness changes and body weight gained. That explained about half of the variance, and that was a strength of evidence when you look at it as a Bayes factor, which is basically an odds ratio, that was 10 times that of the one little glimmer of hope we had for bulking for muscle gain, which was for the bicep thickness measurement only, which only explained about a quarter of the variance in bicep thickness changes. And that was probably because there was more volume at a higher relative effort, proximity to failure, being done in our study for the biceps. So what that tells you is that the main thing that's going to happen if you try to quote-unquote force feed your gains, as both you and I have talked about, rather than just trying to provide an environment for muscle growth to grow. When you're an advanced lifter, when you've probably had the vast majority of your gains already, because this was a sample on well-trained individuals, is that you're going to gain body fat quicker. And that will indirectly lead to you probably having suboptimal muscle mass gains, because most people who want to put on muscle mass, not all, their goal is to look more muscular. And not that there's anything wrong with body fat. It's an organ tissue. It's great. And I'm not going to tell you how you should look, and you should feel free to live your life however you want. But if your goal intersects with health, or especially if it's aesthetics, it is at least something that obscures the visibility of muscularity, or potentially that you might want to curtail from getting too high for health purposes. Which, by the way, if you see where does optimal quote-unquote body composition seem to sit for males, it's like 22% body fat, much higher than the internet would tell you. And ultimately should be determined individually at what point do your health markers actually change, not just an arbitrary 15%, which you're gauging visually. So anyway, eventually, if your goal is aesthetics and you're bulking, quote unquote, for the reason of looking better, gaining too quickly is going to put you in a position where you have to stop gaining and have to do a mini cut of some type. And the very, very slight theoretical advantage you might get from being in a larger surplus will be washed out by the fact that you need to go into deficit to cut. Because what we do have clear data on, recently published meta-regression, is that the larger the deficit, the more it impedes your ability to put on muscle mass. So yes, you can gain muscle at maintenance. Yes, you can even gain muscle in a deficit. But terms and conditions are absolutely applying. And on average, in the meta-regression that was recently published, which we did cover, I think you actually covered it, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, by Murphy.
By Murphy and colleagues. I think 2022? Might be 2023.
Who knows? You publish it electronically, then it hits the journal a year later. Who can keep track?
It was post-COVID. That's all I know.
Yeah.
Was that right around an on average, and your mileage may vary, you are not the mean, you were described somewhere across that standard distribution, a 500 calorie deficit is preventing gains in muscle mass. And if you kind of look at the data more broadly, there's a certain point where that deficit will actually accelerate muscle mass losses. So if you're gaining at 5 times the rate of what would optimize or maximize, muscle mass gains, or at least create that kind of optimum dosage, you're going to be in a position where you're kind of having to rob Peter to pay Paul, and you're not going to come out. You're going to end up owing interest, if you will, on that loaning arrangement. So it is probably optimal, quote unquote, if you give yourself a sufficient surplus to allow the maximal rate of muscle growth that you think you can. And that is going to require primarily a very robust training stimulus, patience, and a surplus that scales downward, unfortunately, to the amount of potential you have left, because your potential is also going to be scaled to the rate at which you can make it. While we don't have data on muscle mass on this, we do have some modeling data on strength, which I think would probably follow at least a similar time course to muscle mass, where we see that essentially there's a logarithmic disproportionate diminishing gain in how quickly you can gain strength. We've covered, Steele has done some great analyses on this, where if it took you a year to go from a 400-pound squat to a 500-pound squat, making that same relative increase is going to take disproportionately longer, logarithmically longer, to make the next jump. I think it was, 10 times as long or something like that?
I don't know the exact number, but I'm no mathematician, but you got the general gist of it.
Yeah. I'll pull it up while you answer the next question. I'll tell people kind of how we can model strength gains, because I think it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, but it is remarkable. I mean, you're lifting for a year and you're like, wow, look at all this rapid progress. I'm sure this will continue linearly forever. And then, the flat part of that logarithmic curve really catches up to you pretty quickly. And then it takes surprisingly long to make similar strides. I mean, you and I, we've talked about this many times off the air, and, we review each other's articles every month for the Mass Research Review. So we're pretty much synchronized in terms of how we view this particular topic. Sometimes there's topics where we disagree and that disagreement persists, but this is one where I think we've always kind of seen eye to eye. And I think the two things I would add, number one, I think it's interesting that when people ask a question about, what surplus should I use to maximize hypertrophy or optimize my rate of, lean mass gains, that's almost never the question they really have in mind. What they really mean is, for a person in my situation with my goals, what is the correct surplus to mostly maximize my rate of muscle gain without inviting a level of fat gain that is not compatible with my goals, right? There's always that kind of sweet spot where you're getting the lion's share of what you're trying to achieve with maximizing the rate of muscle growth without going over and getting to that point where you're inviting either an unnecessary magnitude of fat gain or a magnitude of fat gain that's not compatible with your goals. And I know someone in the chat mentioned that they bulked up to, it's gone, but they did mention with a post that they had bulked up to a particular body fat level that they probably did not intend, based on their comment, intend to maintain. Like they're going to bulk up and then cut down. And they mentioned that after the fact, they kind of struggled with dieting, found it really challenging. So sometimes you do see that situation where people bulk up and say, well, I'll lose the fat later. And then sometimes they find that they end up at a body fat level that for whatever reason, they're not happy with, whether it's due to, aesthetic reasons or health reasons or performance reasons, whatever those reasons might be. The whole time they're bulking, they say, well, I'll just cut it later. They get up to this body fat level and then they say, wow, I'm actually kind of struggling to get back down to a body fat level that is more in line with my goals. So that's something that you really need to keep in mind with this, because, the simplest answer is, if you want to maximize your rate of fat-free mass accretion, just eat as much as you can. But that's almost never what the real goal is. And that's where the more nuanced answer comes into play. The other thing I wanted to mention briefly is that, the comment came back. Imagine that. That's crazy. YouTube, it's a wonderful machine we're working with here.
And they were like, oh, no, it's good. It's okay.
Yeah. But the other thing I wanted to mention, that meta-regression by Murphy and colleagues from a debatable year that happened after COVID. I'm really torn about it because, I was really like in the research world for a while, and then I was really on the periphery. I would, do a couple collaborations here or there, and I was out for the most part for like 4 or 5 years. Now I'm back in, and I found that more than any time in my research career, I'm really adamant about presenting results in a way that is very practical and applicable, very easy to interpret. And so I'm excited. My first paper is pretty much ready to roll and get submitted since I've gotten back. And it was really a major focal point of mine, was to make sure that this is presented super clearly and in a very practical way. And so with the meta-regression by Murphy, I love the way that they did that, but I hate the way that a lot of people are inclined to interpret it as a super literal, generalizable cutoff, right? So you did a great job discussing how it's like, the regression said at around 500 calories of a deficit, that's where muscle gains or lean mass gains seem to be blunted in this regression. But I tell you what, if you bring me someone who's totally new to lifting and they have relatively high body fat to start with, and we put them on a high protein diet and a really great resistance training program, we will build muscle on a 500 calorie per day deficit. I 100%. Almost guarantee it, unless they have truly, like the worst genetics you've ever seen. Like, we will build muscle. So it's really important for people to recognize that there are so many assumptions built into a meta-analysis or a meta-regression model where you kind of smooth out all of these contextual factors that really do matter, right? And that's not the fault of the meta-analysts by any means. It's just a reality of what you're doing there statistically. So all of that is to say, I totally agree with you, but I also echo your caution that the 500 calorie number, I think, is a useful number, but it's not a literal cutoff that you're going to take to the bank.
2 comments on that.
Yeah.
One is, based upon our recently recorded, soon to come out Iron Culture episode, I think that's a really valuable thing that you're doing, to discuss the error around any given point estimate or mean outcome, because I think the natural tendency, it's just the way humans think, it's no one's fault, is that when they're reading about statistical significances between groups or meta-regressions or meta-analytic outcomes, because of our desire to latch onto specific numbers that give me confidence in a specific answer, we assume they apply directly to us or equally to all people in all conditions, when they absolutely don't. And we have to do a better job as science communicators, even than maybe on paper we should have to, with discussing those points. So I'm glad you did. And the second one is me correcting why I said randomly 10 times as long to gain the same amount of strength you do in one period. It's not that. It's twice as long. It's far less pessimistic. It was a linear log relationship. So if it took you a month to go from a 150-pound bench press to 175, you might get to 225, good old 2 plates, in 2 months after that. On average, your mileage may vary. All caveats that apply to that meta-regression repre to that statement as well. But it's pretty cool. It's been modeled in thousands of lifters. And it just kind of shows, it's diminishing returns as you go, and the stronger or bigger you want to get, the harder or the longer you have to work at achieving that.
Yeah, I'm sure some math whizzes are laughing at us or cringing as we fumble around with log curves. But fun fact, Helms, I managed somehow. My PhD is in human movement science. It's a very movement-oriented degree program with like really high-level biomechanics courses, a lot of motion involved. I somehow have never taken even an introductory level calculus course.
Me neither.
I've found a way to avoid it my entire life. And eventually I grew to love statistics, which requires no calculus at all. But yeah, when I tell people that who are in my field, they're like, how in the world did that happen? And I still don't really know.
I'm in the same exact boat. Mine was a little more intentional though. So I also managed to avoid some of the harder core physiology and chemistry. So I'm completely lacking in all basic sciences. So,
I did not get out of the chemistry. That is for sure.
Yep.
All right, Helms, here's a good one. This is one that's kind of right up our alley. The listener says, I'd be interested in how you work with clients that have signs of a negative body image, but don't necessarily want to work on it. They don't really have an inclination or a desire to improve their body image. So the question is, do you just give them what they ask for, help them with fat loss at the expense of maybe further promoting the idea that their self-worth is going to be dependent on how they look and more specifically how lean they are? I'll take a crack at this one first, and then we'll kind of switch roles here and you can kind of clean up afterward and tell me everything I got wrong. So when I'm working with someone like this, basically they fill out my intake form, and that's step one. If you're going to be a coach, you need to make sure that your intake form or your application is written in a way that this type of stuff will actually be apparent and observable, right? So you want to make sure that you have a comprehensive enough application or kind of questionnaire at the beginning where people will essentially get an opportunity to manifest some of these underlying concerns that might be really pertinent, right? So if your screener or your questionnaire at the beginning is not actually drawing these things out, then you probably need to think about that and figure out how to make your screening process a little bit more effective. So in the initial screening, the first thing I do, I'll check the questionnaire, maybe we hop on a call. And what I'm trying to figure out first is, can I or should I work with this individual? And that can get a lot harder than people think, right? So I used to do a lot of this screening and, would kind of send people to different coaches and stuff, and sometimes take clients on myself. And what was really challenging is, there's the one end of the spectrum where there's just no body image concerns at all. Cool. They can work with just about anybody, right? There's the other end of the extreme where it's like someone really ought to be in an inpatient facility getting direct treatment for an eating disorder or a body image disorder. And that's pretty simple, right? How you communicate about that is not so simple, but that you should not be coaching this person to lose fat, right? It's pretty obvious. But there are some people that are kind of they're in the middle there where you say, I know that there's some concerns here. I know that this is, maybe a moderate risk situation, but the problem is something I encountered over years of working and coaching is some folks find themselves in this really weird spot where a dietitian or someone with like direct experience with body image and potentially disordered eating will say, oh, you don't really need me. Your insurance won't cover it. It's not really necessary. But then more cautious practitioners who are not trained in that area will say, there's a little bit too high risk for me. And they find themselves in a position where they actually really struggle to get help, which is really unfortunate. So while you want to be, responsible and conservative and just say, oh, if there's any sign of a risk or a red flag, I'm out. But then we find these people who really deserve, to be able to get service and to get help pursuing their goals. And they really struggle to find someone who is both qualified and willing to help them out. So it is kind of tricky, but if I get to the point where I say, okay, I can work with this person, I feel comfortable with it, it feels like a responsible thing to do, it's within my scope of practice, the whole time I'm working with them, I'm going to keep an eye out for any signals or any red flags that we're actually getting into a more clinical space than a fitness space. And that's really the line for the scope of practice. I mean, obviously, scope of practice differs by person, by jurisdiction. But usually when you find yourself doing work that starts to feel more clinical and you feel like you're doing more about body image than you are about, the nuts and bolts of the diet and training and behavior change, that's when you have to give yourself the wiggle room to kind of back out and say, hey, I'm going to need to refer you to someone with more expertise in this area because we're going into a realm I don't feel comfortable with. But before you get there, hopefully you don't get there. If I'm working with someone who has these kind of, preliminary signs that maybe we're on thin ice here, or we at least need to be cautious, one thing I like to do is incorporate some goals that are unrelated to weight loss. Even if they did reach out to me for weight loss, I try to make sure that we have a more comprehensive set of goals so that, we're pursuing, and it's got to be important to them. So you work with them to figure out what those are, but maybe we're working on a bench press PR while we're doing this weight loss phase, and we're making note of how we're doing, chasing the kids around the house, getting stronger and building up more stamina. There's a variety of non-weight goals that you can incorporate there. I'll also, when I'm working with this person, I'll be extremely careful with my word selection. And this is a place where I've really worked on this over the years, because I would find myself earlier in my career on a podcast, I would say things that were self-deprecating, but that would generalize in a way that I didn't intend, right? So like if I describe myself as fat when I was 16% body fat, what message does that convey to anyone out there who's greater than 16% body fat? Certainly not a good one. If I say on days where I, deviate from my diet, if I say I ate like a slob, or ate like, I've heard people say I ate like an asshole, it's like, those are conveying ideas that are really not favorable, especially when you're talking in a coach-client type of situation. So I think if anyone's been stalking me over the years, they'll notice that I'm a lot less careless with some of those throwaway lines that people see, especially in the bodybuilding world. People have kind of decided if I'm not like 7% body fat, then for me, I'm fat, right? So you get used to this kind of lingo within the bodybuilding world, and it's really not conducive to building strong relationships with clients or conveying really positive messages to the public. So especially if I'm working with a client in this situation, I get extremely careful with my word selection, and I get really careful about what I'm encouraging or discouraging as a coach. So the type of feedback that I'm providing, I'm making sure that I'm not nudging them toward, really rigid ideas of what's good or bad with their diet, what's good or bad with their weigh-ins, their appearance. You have to just be really, really careful about how you're communicating with that individual, what behaviors and patterns you're reinforcing, and what behaviors and patterns you're discouraging in a positive way. And then finally, when you're working with someone in this situation, you refer out when necessary. When you start to say, okay, the body image concerns are a little bit more intensive, a little bit more extreme than I initially thought. Hey, what are you going to do? You use your best judgment. Sometimes you're incorrect. At that point, I would refer out to someone who has more direct training in that area. So the short version of the answer is, do I just give them what they ask for and treat them like any old client? The answer is no. I can do an assessment and see if it's appropriate to help them with a weight loss goal. There have been times where I've had people apply for weight loss support and I say, your BMI is like 19 and like, you're not trying to do like a physique competition. You just want to lose weight. And I don't feel good about helping someone in your situation lose weight because you have a BMI of 19 and you're telling me that you're fat and that you need to lose this weight for a wedding. And I'm not on board with that, So all of that is to say, I don't just give them what they ask for. I figure out, is this goal actually something that would be advisable from a clinical perspective? If I told a clinician I helped someone do this, would they look at me like I was a jerk? That's usually the litmus test. And so you have to, first figure out, is this an appropriate thing for us to collaborate on? And then find ways to make it a more... You basically want to set yourself up for success, yourself and your client, by doing some of those steps, and always, always have the humility to, when you're halfway through and you realize you've made a mistake, have the humility to say, I erred in judgment. This was not a good plan, and I'm going to have to refer out and make sure that this client is getting the support they need.
I would co-sign literally everything you said. And I think I can provide some maybe useful supplemental material. Um, I think the first thing, some of the things that people should really be aware of that preclude even being able to follow your advice is you need to have someone you can refer to who you trust, who has this skill set. And that is a little rarer than I wish it was. People who understood both fitness and people with body composition goals and disordered eating, eating disorders, and body image concerns. But they exist. So, for example, we have Amanda Rizzo. And also to screen people, you need to have a screening tool. And I would say that you might think, okay, well, let me find a validated questionnaire. Like if you're really super evidence-based, you'd be like, let me find a validated questionnaire that has, good discriminant validity that can tell people between who have disordered eating patterns and non. And then all of a sudden your intake form is everything you need plus a 60-item questionnaire with Likert scales, and you need to actually do repeated measures and use statistical software to decide if you screened an athlete. Don't do that. What you probably want is to then communicate with that person who you have an agreement with where you can refer to them and have them look over your intake form and maybe just suggest a few questions. Or even, of course, you can think about this too, right? So you want to make sure the burden isn't so high that, that person's not even going to take your intake form and then just go work with someone who doesn't do screening, right?
Yeah.
So that is one minor point, or two minor points is, you need the right person to refer to who you trust and you have good rapport with. You need that screening tool. 3, it's just because there are moments in your coach-client relationship that are outside of your scope doesn't mean that you have to go, I can't touch you. You go with them. There are absolutely opportunities where you work in tandem with someone else and it becomes a multidisciplinary team. And this should be client-led. I think you don't need to have these kind of like back-end secret conversations with the person who you would refer to, like, oh, I'm really worried about this person. That might be how it starts. But I think you need to have it, front of mind that a possibility could be that you keep working on them with their training, and then in consultation with the person you would refer to, you might give them some types of nutrition advice, but not others. And then they would also regularly meet with this person who is, an actual clinician in this space. That is very similar to what you might do with a physical therapist or a team doctor when you're an S&C coach, right? Okay, what can we do? Cool. Oh, so all the upper body training sessions I got, but then I do these exercises as prehab and these as rehab on leg day. Got it. A similar kind of parallel or analogy. So those are the 2 major kind of specific points. And then 2 other points that I would say in terms of what this might actually look like and some useful strategies that I've found. 1, I have also adopted and changed my terminology, and even when I'm working with bodybuilders. So first, I'll address some other ways I've changed my terminology, like subtle stuff. I try to avoid saying improving body composition because that's contextual. It's sometimes improving body composition means gaining body fat, like say during the recovery phase of a competitive bodybuilder or for a recovering anorexic, right? Or sorry, someone with anorexia, speaking of using appropriate terminology.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important. And when I look at it from the perspective of bodybuilding, there's a ton of overlap between societal expectations, social media, and quote unquote diet culture and competitive bodybuilding, but there absolutely doesn't have to be. Because ultimately, because competitive bodybuilding is a sport, I use terms like sport-supported behaviors, and I come at it from a performance lens. Performance in an aesthetic, subjective physique sport, but still performance. And this is really, really useful because most of the time, when I'm dealing with someone in kind of this gray zone as described by the question asker, they have performance goals from a bodybuilding perspective that will actually be harmed at some point or to some degree by these kind of semi-subclinical body image issues. And I can absolutely, as a bodybuilding coach, point out where their perspective is not facilitating them reaching their goals. And I can do that in a compassionate way that doesn't require me to be a clinician. So, for example, I think the best thing right now for us to put on as much muscle as possible would be to maybe nudge you up closer to where I think your lower intervention point is, which means gaining some body fat. And then they go, hold the phone, They go, oh, okay. So your willingness to engage in these actions doesn't align with what is the best way to get to your goals. I'm not judging that. I'm pointing it out, and then they get to sit with that discordance or that dissonance, if you will, between, oh, maybe these behaviors that I think or I'm masking with what is going to help me become a better quote unquote bodybuilder, competitive or non-competitor, are actually not, and I'm using them as an excuse or to cover up some of these body image issues that I have that are actually now very clearly not serving me, that I did need that coach to point out compassionately or even dispassionately sometimes is the best you can do. I think that kind of clinical performance focused perspective, it's the same that you would tell your power lifter, your squats, they're looking great, you're moving up, but I don't think that would be legal. I think the head judge might give you a white light, but you're probably going to get 2 reds. So I'm ecstatic that you got a PR, but that probably wouldn't count in competition. So we need to do some things and troubleshoot how we can get you to, look like you're hitting depth from the side. And I think that's the same strategy I would take. Of course, still being aware that the language you use and what you say and the recommendations you give can put someone in a position where they are doing something that might be harmful if they have a true, psychological issue related to body image. But when it is something where they're not willing or desiring to work on that, either expressing that directly or very subtly, it doesn't mean that there aren't opportunities for you to at least help them be aware of how their attitudes, perspectives, behaviors are not helping them. And that sometimes can be the difference between them acknowledging and moving towards change versus trying to stay in a state of denial or kind of kicking the can down the road. So yeah, those are the only things I would add, Eric. I think you did a great job with that.
Awesome. Well, I tell you what, man, there's a couple supplement ones that I want to answer really quickly. I haven't touched on supplements in a while, either in my mass writing or really in office hours. But there's a couple good questions here, and then I want to dive into the live chat and kind of do a little rapid fire and make sure everyone gets their questions answered here. So quick one about creatine. Someone said, I travel a lot for work, and so I like creatine hydrochloride because it's a smaller container, smaller size, and I can take a smaller dose. Is there any disadvantage of creatine hydrochloride other than the price? So this is an area where a lot of times that claim is made. Creatine hydrochloride, a lot of times they'll say only take 2 or 3 grams instead of 5 grams of creatine monohydrate because it's more soluble and so on and so forth. Now, it is true, I'm pretty certain that creatine hydrochloride dissolves a little better in water than creatine monohydrate. Creatine monohydrate dissolves okay, but not great. That's why a lot of people put their creatine monohydrate in a hot beverage like hot water. So creatine hydrochloride may dissolve a little bit better, but this whole premise of using a lower dose and getting the same magnitude of kind of supplement benefits, I can't really get on board with that premise because creatine monohydrate is absorbed really well. So it's not like you're going to absorb only a small fraction of the 5 grams you would normally take. And beyond that, I don't really see the justification for hydrochloride enabling a smaller dose to have an outsized impact, because if you look at creatine hydrochloride, I'm pretty sure it provides about 78% of creatine by mass. So there's a creatine portion and a hydrochloride portion. I think by weight, 78% of that is creatine. And I think with creatine monohydrate, it's actually closer to 90% creatine by mass. So I think there's been some really slick marketing with regards to creatine hydrochloride, but I really don't see a reason to justify it. And honestly, if you just want to carry around a smaller container, I mean, if you've got an old creatine hydrochloride container sitting around, just put your creatine monohydrate in it and take 2 or 3 grams of that. In most cases, if you've been on creatine for a while, a 2 or 3 gram dose when you're traveling you're probably not going to have any meaningful difference compared to when you're normally taking 5 grams per day. All you're trying to do is really top things off there. So that would be my answer. Helms, anything to add to that?
No, I would echo that 100%.
Yeah.
Sometimes for traveling, it can be convenient. It doesn't take up less space, but it is nice to not have to take a powder. If you can find the pill form of creatine monohydrate, you have to take like 8
Yeah.
or like 10 pills to get to 5 grams. But again, like you said, Trex, if it's a week or even 3 weeks of traveling, and let's say you're a larger individual, you need 5 grams daily to maintain, your supplemental levels of muscle creatine. Doing 2 to 3 grams, you're going to see like the slowest decay ever in your muscle creatine levels, and you could take the pills with you, and you don't have to deal with the airport security as much, or having to deal with powder in your luggage.
Yeah. All right. The other supplement one here. The question was about plant-based protein powders. So this individual had heard that plant-based protein powders, that you should limit your intake of them because of heavy metals that are present in the soil and therefore are present in plant-based protein powders. And so the question is, basically, is that a realistic concern? Is that a valid concern? So there are a couple independent groups that have done analyses of protein powders. And across the board, you are going to find some presence of these kind of heavy metals that are going to be in protein products. It's normal, you're going to find a little bit of mercury, lead, cadmium, arsenic. It's not that unusual to find these things, even in conventional food products, in low amounts. So that is true for animal-based protein powders and plant-based protein powders. It is true. There's very good evidence that the amount of these heavy metals is slightly higher in plant-based protein powders than animal-based protein powders. That is definitely true. But this is like one of those things where you'll find some of these kind of fringe, almost sciencey groups who will do these analyses about pesticides and say, well, this vegetable has 8 times more pesticides than this one, so you should, make your food decisions accordingly. That's really not what we're looking at when we're making these types of decisions. What we want to know is, when I eat a typical amount of this food, am I exposing myself to a clinically relevant dose of whatever thing I'm concerned about? So that's why, some of these things about plant-based protein powders, one of the reasons it's really tricky is because there's definitely a clear grain of truth to this concept. But the question is, the fact that plant-based protein powders have more of these heavy metals relative to animal-based, does that mean I should limit my intake of them? Or does that mean I should avoid them entirely? And there's a really nice study that was published in 2020 by Bandera and colleagues in Toxicology Reports. And I love the way they did the study. They got a bunch of protein powders, some animal-based, some plant-based, and they basically did independent testing to verify their content of these heavy metals, and then they kind of laid out what is your actual exposure in a cumulative sense if you have 1 serving per day, 365 days out of the year, or if you have 3 servings per day. And so basically in their analysis, they found that even with plant-based powders, even if you are doing 3 servings a day of these protein products, you're still not getting into a point where they would be concerned in terms of a clinically relevant level of exposure. So I'm inclined to say, just for a variety of different reasons, if you find yourself consuming more than like 2 or 3 servings of a particular protein product per day, you probably want to take a look at that and introduce more variety into your diet if you can. It's not just a heavy metal exposure thing, but also what nutrients are you missing out on when you're getting most of your protein from these, highly refined powders that are not bringing in all these other elements of the food matrix with them. But I would say, when it comes to heavy metal exposure, we've seen that up to 3 servings a day tends to be totally fine. That doesn't mean that 4 pushes you over. It just means, that's kind of how they did their analysis. When we look at soy protein, a lot of folks say, well, if I have too much of it, there's some case studies, maybe there are, estrogenic effects or feminizing effects. We've got a study by Cody Hahn and colleagues where I think they were doing at least 80 grams per day just from soy protein powder, and found no increase in estrogenic activity or reduction in androgenic activity. So when it comes to supplementing with common plant-based proteins, I think you're pretty much in the clear as long as you're. I mean, we have very clear empirical evidence that even if you're getting half of a very high protein diet from these, roughly speaking, you're good to go. If you are going beyond that, you're kind of getting outside of the range of what we have really hard data for. But I'm still not really super concerned about it when it comes to specifically, feminizing effects with soy or heavy metal exposure with some of these more conventional proteins. Anything to add, Helms?
I'm just a big fan of heavy metal exposure, as you can see here from my Rascal apparel. So that's all I have to say.
Beautiful shirt.
Thank you.
All right, man. Let's jump into the chat here. We got quite a few things here. Zordos is in there talking a bunch of nonsense. No thanks, Mike. Not even going to address that. Here's the one comment that, like I said, they mentioned, bulking up to a body fat level. Now they want to reduce body fat, and, they've been told to focus 100% on their diet and walking, and they've been told to keep their lifting to a minimum. And they're asking, is that the way to go? And I would say no. I mean, for weight loss, I definitely would focus on the diet. I'm in Herman Pontzer's lab now at Duke, and that's kind of one of the things that really shines through in his research, is that exercise alone is not a great standalone intervention for dramatic amounts of weight loss. People tend to lose weight when they engage in an exercise intervention, but it's usually like a kilogram after 8 to 12 weeks. It's not what we would call a clinically relevant magnitude of weight loss. Yeah. For weight loss, I would definitely focus on diet, but there's no reason to cut back on lifting just because you're interested in losing some body fat. I would say lifting, quite the contrary. I mean, doing a lot of walking is going to be fantastic as well. So I'd say two out of 3 elements there are good. But lifting is fantastic for any weight loss endeavor because it's going to help you maintain your strength, maintain muscularity. There are a variety of benefits, and there's certainly no detriment. So if lifting is conducive with your goals outside of receiving this advice, then I would definitely keep lifting in the program.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is that technically, especially if you're someone who is, and I would think almost in all cases where someone is going, hey, I'm thinking about doing some weight loss. Should I engage in lifting? That they don't have much of a training background. If you're a novice to lifting weights, you will actually lose more body fat with the same deficit by engaging in resistance training and being in a calorie deficit, because you're going to be putting on muscle mass. And if you just think about the energetics of that, it results in a better body composition outcome and change. Because your body is not only losing fat, but also having to go through the process of producing muscle mass to adapt to what you're asking it to do, which, as we discussed earlier, is absolutely possible to see body recomposition changes when you are really a newbie to lifting, and unless if you're doing just enough right. So you will actually lose more body fat as a early stage lifter, and as a later stage lifter, I don't really see this question coming up, but just to put it out there, just to cover all our bases. You don't want to go through a phase of dieting without resistance training, because you're going to lose muscle mass at a greater rate, right? So, and you won't lose as much fat. And
something that's a little bit lesser known is that for whatever reason, I don't think we really understand why yet, but the loss of fat-free mass during a diet seems to be predictive of weight regain. And specifically, it seems to be a pretty notable driver of hunger after weight loss. So we know.
I bet you that's organ mass. That's my guess.
Yeah, I think I mentioned that in one of my more recent articles that I was covering that one recently about weight regain, and I was like, I do wonder if organ mass is really driving the whole thing here. But I will say, I don't know. I'm not ready to write off the idea that muscle has some impact, but I think organ mass is probably the more intuitive explanation there. But either way, it seems like the loss of fat-free mass really drives hunger during and after weight loss. And so to the extent that you can keep lean mass on, it seems to be good. And I do think I reviewed a study where I think one of the studies I reviewed by Martins and colleagues did find that resistance training attenuated weight regain in a way that probably wouldn't impact organ mass, but would impact muscle mass. I'll have to dig back into that paper and see if I can gain some insight from that. But all of that is to say, lifting is good. We support it. Look at Helms' shirt. That's all you need to know.
Right.
All right, Helms, before I do that, I want to give a shout out. Bloop Bloop says, Trex Nation, Trex Army in the house. Let's go, with many O's.
Trex.
I appreciate that.
Trex Hive. Those are my people.
The Trex Hive, Trextopia. We've also got Hussam says, loves the work. I appreciate that. Now, Helms, you've been called out. Question for Helms. The last few years, you have written programs from a non-split perspective for yourself, i.e. you don't have predetermined days for specific muscle groups. Is that true? Are we accepting the premise?
I would say that the way I write programs can result in having specific muscle groups on specific days, but it can also result in having many muscle groups on the same day, which are not traditionally trained together, but they would still be muscle groups you're training on those days.
Okay, so
to be pedantic.
I laid out the premise. Now the question is, all that stuff, but your current off-season program seems to have been constructed using a split. You seem to have assigned days for specific muscle groups. What are the reasons behind this change in approach to programming? Will you change back, and do different approaches for different situations make sense to you? Like, is that a change that has occurred? And if so, is it intentional, and why?
It's actually not a change. So I'm actually glad I addressed pedantically the premise, because I do think that there was a misunderstanding to the way I programmed before and now, because it's actually the same process, but they result in different outcomes depending upon the needs of the individual. I think Berto did a really good job of explaining this, and where this perception came from is me on a few different podcasts 3, 4, 5 years ago, and probably most prominently an interview I did in 2019 with Jeff Nippard, where my training, and this is my fault, was characterized as full body 5 days a week. But what it actually is having no restrictions on which body part I train when I train. And Berto described this really well in a 3DMJ YouTube video as inside-out programming. So for bodybuilding, although it could be applied to performance, and in fact it's more commonly applied to the way powerlifters do it, is you work from a perspective of what do I need to get done in the course of a microcycle, and then from there, what's the best way to distribute that to get the best balance between recovery and stimulus. So this is something powerlifters do all the time. Okay, I need to get in 4 bench sessions, 3 squat sessions, 2 deadlift sessions. I need to think about how they're ordered. I unfortunately have to acknowledge Zerdos in the chat right now. His whole PhD dissertation is around this. Like, oh, okay, if I'm going to have 3 sessions, a heavy practice day, low volume, moderate loads, if I'm going to have a high volume, moderate load day closer to failure, a hypertrophy session, and if I'm going to have a strength session where I got moderately heavy loads with multiple sets, I want to set those up in an order so they facilitate the best performance under the curve. So I'm going to have that heavy practice day follow the high volume session so that I recover for that heavy day with a fair amount of volume that's arguably most important. You can take a same strategic approach to the way you program bodybuilding. Instead of arbitrarily, arguably, choosing a body part split and then fitting your volume needs into that and the exercise selection and the proximities to failure, you can instead say, I think these number of sets for each muscle group based upon my individual needs, weak points, skeletal structure, and things that need less or more development for my divisional requirements, say if you're bikini or men's physique or something like that. And here's the equipment I have access to. Here's where I find I recover best, the balance between proximity to failure, how long I'm going to run a mesocycle. Here's what I need to do. And here's the time availability I have, the equipment availability, the number of days in the week. I'm going to put it there. So for the last, 13 years, 12 years, since 2011, I have been a bottom-heavy bodybuilder who also happens, and this is probably why I was bottom-heavy, responded quite well to low volumes from essentially the waist down besides my calves, but seemed to respond to higher volumes from the waist up. So what this meant is that I need a lot of work on my upper body and not very much on my lower body And because of me following more quote unquote balanced programs, perpetuating me being bottom heavy, I was actually in a position where I didn't really want my legs to grow. So that meant that I had this skewed proportion of volume where I'm doing maybe 6 to 10 sets for glutes, hams, quads in combination through compounds or individually, depending upon how you count it, and 2 to 3 times that amount for my upper body. So my quote unquote 5 day full body session ended up being upper body days plus 0 to 3 leg movements. So some days it was upper body plus calves. Some days it was a little more, leg dominant, where I would do, say, leg press, leg curl, calf raise, and then 2 or 3 upper body movements. And I think that got mischaracterized as I'm doing full body or I'm not doing a body part split. But I mean, that's still a body part split. Full body is a body part split. You're still training body parts. Now, however, I've finally corrected that. My symmetry is now at the point where I was able to be more successful competitively. And the feedback I got from both judges and the people around me and everyone I trust and my current, basically pit crew of coaches at 3DMJ is everything's got to come up if I want to be competitive on the WNBF Pro stage. And I would actually benefit from having bigger glutes, hams, and quads, not just a bigger upper body. So now you take the same system of inside-out programming where you determine your needs for each group and then you figure out the best way to distribute it, has resulted in still not having any limitation on what muscle groups I train on certain days, but I do actually have one pure leg day, and that is day 4 in my 5-day program. So day 1, it's an upper body session that is dominated by shoulders, back, and chest. Day 2 is legs and arms. I don't know, is that a body part split? The third day I train is a comprehensive upper body session. The 4th day I train is a comprehensive lower body session. And then I have a shoulders and arms dominant upper body day to finish it off. And you can take that same system, plug in different needs. You plug in a bikini competitor who has really good upper body genetics and poor lower body genetics, and you're going to get a different outcome. So my actual programming strategy, approach, and principles have not changed. And if anyone is interested, we actually do have a 3DMJ Vault course called Bodybuilding Program Design on that you can check out at the 3DMJVault.com. Shameless plug for our own self-promotion. But no, same philosophy, same approach, different needs as I've advanced as a competitor.
All right, good stuff. So I want to make sure we get to a bunch of these, so let's try to keep our answers as concise as we can. I know it's not easy for either of us. The individual who asked about avoiding lifting during fat loss had a couple follow-up questions. I just want to briefly acknowledge them. So they said that their coach, it sounds like the question is, does lifting heavy and hard make it more difficult to lose fat? No, absolutely not. And as we discussed previously, quite the opposite, really. The individual also said that their coach told them that leaning out, getting leaner primes the body for future muscle growth. Is that true? My answer, I feel pretty confident saying that no, that is not true. I've written about that in mass pretty extensively and outside of mass pretty extensively. That idea is kind of there's a little hint of science that kind of led to that idea, but I think the preponderance of evidence pretty strongly refutes that concept. So yeah, I wouldn't worry about that at all. Someone asked, following up to what we were talking about, Helms, is there any way to cause non-skeletal organ hypertrophy? Not in a good way. Pretty much anytime you're talking about like an enlarged liver or an enlarged heart and an enlarged anything that isn't muscle, it's going to be bad. So there are ways to enlarge a liver or a heart, for example, but none that would be good or advisable. So
I'm only comfortable with left ventricular hypertrophy that's in proportion to the chamber size. And how do you do that? Lift weights and do cardio.
Exactly. Yeah. We got a question here. Any good studies that back the use of cortisol blockers? I would say no. Usually, I think cortisol, if you're noticing that there's an elevation of cortisol consistently, I think you're better served at figuring out why that is and addressing the root cause of that cortisol elevation rather than trying to deal with the cortisol itself. And if you were going to try to deal with the cortisol itself, I'm not convinced that these, dietary supplements are really the way to do that. So I can't really think of a practical use that I would have for cortisol blockers. Helms, anything to add there?
9 out of 10 times when I talk to the person to ask them questions or asking this question, one, they haven't actually measured cortisol. Two, the purported cortisol blocker has no impact on cortisol. And then three, the understanding of cortisol as a almost across the board negative hormone, or just associating it with negative outcomes, is a very, very partial and limited understanding. So the entire paradigm of thinking generally needs to change.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, we got one here. How bad is it to sleep just 4 hours? So only 4 hours of sleep after an intense workout, when the other days I slept over 7.5. How much does the lack of sleep on one day per week influence hypertrophy and recovery? Honestly, I wouldn't worry about it that much. I don't think the evidence would suggest that having one night of poor sleep is really going to make or break anything. I'd focus more on your cumulative sleep throughout the week, getting that on a consistent basis. Of course, the ideal scenario is getting adequate, high quality sleep every single night, but life happens. Sometimes it's not going to work out that way, and I really wouldn't worry about having one night a week where sleep is a little bit shorter.
Yeah, and I would just add that this is not that uncommon. Some people, hard workouts disrupt their sleep a little bit, and just so long as your program is not such that it's always disrupting your sleep, that you are getting more good nights than bad, it is much more about the cumulative impact of everything together versus being too focused on what happened on the day I trained.
Yeah. Here's a good one. So trying to work yoga into the daily routine to improve some mobility, but I can only do it in the morning, about 3 to 4 hours before I lift. Any concerns about lifting while limber? So any concerns about doing this, what's the term? It's not dynamic, static stretching, 3 to 4 hours before resistance training. I'd say absolutely no problem at all. I think Helms, you'd probably agree. Mike Zordos usually writes about, he's done a lot of stretching stuff within mass. And, there is some truth to the idea that, really intense, really extreme stretching immediately before a lift would be disadvantageous for performance. But, even a pretty moderate static stretching session fairly close to your lift probably isn't going to do much at all in terms of performance. You have to really hold that stretch at a pretty unbearable position for a pretty unbearable amount of time. But yeah, 3 to 4 hours before, I wouldn't worry about it whatsoever.
Yeah, a yoga session would be sufficient if it was literally right before training to negatively impact power production and force production. But 3 to 4 hours later is enough time for that muscle tendon unit to kind of get back to its typical length. And I would say the only caveat would be, do make sure that you're warming up appropriately for the resistance training session, which would include potentially dynamic, explosive body weight movements, or at the very least, that's not necessarily required, doing lighter lifts building up to your top sets. So I think so long as you warm up appropriately for resistance training, you should be preparing the muscle tendon unit to be at the appropriate stiffness for the lifting when you're doing that acutely.
Yeah.
And you may even potentially grow from the yoga based upon some of the more recent data on serious stretching that's held for a long period of time coming out of Warnicke's lab.
Yeah. All right, here's one. So why do we differentiate between RED-S, or relative energy deficiency in sport, and other types of malnutrition? What is special about malnutrition that's exercise induced? I am glad we got this question because I think this is a bit of a misconception. I would not consider RED-S, I wouldn't really put it under the malnutrition umbrella. So when we talk about clinical malnutrition, a lot of times we're talking about, an inadequacy in the diet that is leading to clinical symptomology, right? So you'll see situations where people are low on micronutrients, for example, vitamin C, and they start to have really, catastrophic outward physical manifestations of that inadequacy in the diet. And, you'll start to see symptoms of scurvy, for example. You'll see in instances of protein malnutrition, a particular clinical presentation that is a very serious health concern. When we talk about relative energy deficiency in sport, we are talking, I would say, about a broad collection, a kind of milieu of adaptations to a particular set of constraints. And those constraints are, exercise engagement and low energy availability, kind of in combination. Some of those adaptations are maladaptive with regards to the overall health of the individual. I don't think a lot of folks would say, the changes related to bone health and the reproductive system are advantageous by any means. Some of those adaptations are purely adaptations. They are not necessarily clinically relevant health issues per se. So it's interesting with Red S because what you're seeing, it could very well be a person who is eating enough protein that they're not experiencing protein malnutrition. They are not going to starve to death. There's not like a serious clinical risk of, starvation. They are not, you could see a situation where they're not deficient in any particular micronutrient to a clinically relevant degree. And so what we're really looking at there is just a series of adaptations to a chronic level of physical activity and energy balance. So I think the reason that we differentiate is because they are quite distinct. And I personally wouldn't really consider Red S to be a simple instance of malnutrition. I think it is a different enough situation that it really ought to be described and discussed in a very distinct way. What do you think, Helms?
Yeah, I actually took the time to look up malnutrition as defined by the World Health Organization. And malnutrition does refer to deficiencies, excesses, or imbalances in a person's intake of energy and or nutrients. And it addresses three broad groups of conditions: undernutrition, micronutrient-related malnutrition, and overweight or obesity and diet-related non-communicable diseases, such as heart disease, stroke, diabetes, and some cancers, which are impacted by nutrition. Interestingly enough, though, you'd think, Red S is undernutrition. It's not having enough energy for what you're asking your body to do. But when you actually look at what an undernutrition is then defined as, the World Health Organization, they're looking at specific outcomes more so: wasting, stunting, underweight, and deficiencies in vitamins and minerals. And you can actually have a situation where someone is experiencing REDS, but they are not necessarily underweight. It has not resulted in stunted growth because they're adults. They are not actively wasting. They're not necessarily at the point or the severity of low energy availability yet, or will not get to the point where they're actually losing lean mass that is essential for health or performance. And they don't have any deficiencies in vitamins and minerals. It is relatively common in weight class restricted athletes and also, say, marathon runners and endurance athletes cyclically sometimes, because they're going through a temporary period where they're cutting weight or having a very high volume of training, and unintentionally, or despite their best efforts, and despite what looks like a good diet on paper, they're unable to meet the nutritional requirements of that high energy expenditure. And that is something that, you have to strategize on an individual basis to correct. So I don't think, also, like, from a physique athlete's perspective, it's not something you can fix. You may have to get into a state of REDS, and I would not call it malnutrition in the context of sports performance, because malnutrition literally means bad nutrition. Like, you're doing the nutrition that is appropriate for your sporting goal. And when I speak to sports dietitians, when you start to talk about REDS, or Red S, I should say, they always they start to talk about prevention. And I think that's because they don't have a perspective for some of these sports where there is a requirement at certain phases to be in some degree of low energy availability. And then it does come down to management. And when you talk about malnutrition from a clinical nutrition perspective, management is also not the goal. Like, you're looking to, okay, well, how do I correct the food supply, or how do we find more, how do I deal with the socioeconomic issues that are resulting in this population having it? And what do I tell them are the minimum guidelines, to prevent it? So I think you could probably technically argue that it is a undernutrition energy deficiency for the specific goals of the person. But I don't think the paradigm of perspective for the intentions of what people mean when they say malnutrition is applicable to REDS or Red S in the same way.
Yeah, and I'll just, put my bias out there. I generally am hesitant to adopt overly clinical nature for things pertaining to fitness and sport. Now, there are clinical ramifications of RED-S, and I don't want to diminish that, but I also I try to be very measured with using any kind of language that has severe clinical connotations to it. And so with relative energy deficiency in sport, I usually, when you're consulting with someone who's in that situation, it's already a sensitive topic, and you probably don't want to, fan those flames by throwing around words like, malnourished, malnutrition, things like that. So yeah, I generally reserve words like that kind of have a heavy weight to them. I try to keep those on the shelf unless we really need to break out the serious terminology there.
Absolutely. We can haggle over pedantic terminology when it comes to I want to write a research paper and get through peer review, but I think when you're dealing with athletes, you really need to speak the appropriate language, taking in kind of the emotional intelligence of the situation. Yeah. Because as we discussed earlier, terminology can have potential harm.
Yeah. All right, Helms, I have a plan here. There's a lot of training questions, and I think I'm kind of doing like a principal components analysis and aggregating them into 2 nodes of questions here. Let's go. The first one's pretty quick here. So there's a couple questions that get at the general idea of training frequency and whether, let's say you're going to do 10 sets for your quads this week. Are you better off doing a couple hard sessions where you're doing 5 sets each, or are you better off doing, 2 sets every time you go into the gym 5 days this week? Does it matter to you, and which one do you prefer, if any?
Yeah, actually, there's some unpublished data that is going to be coming out from the same group that did the meta-regression on proximity to failure on volume per session. And there does seem to be a point, and this has already been actually it's also unpublished, but it's an in-house meta-analytic done by James Krieger, where there is a point where you start to get diminishing effects from trying to do too much volume in a single session. And from what I've seen, I think a decent heuristic, and I'm going to include some error on this, so it's not the point estimate, but maybe a standard deviation or a 95% confidence interval equivalent, probably between 6 to 10 sets per muscle group per session of hard sets that are directly training the muscle group. So you could potentially maybe go a little higher if you had, say, like a leg press and a leg extension versus like all leg extensions. For the quads, for example, or for the glutes. So I think once you're starting to get to the point where you're looking at double digits volume, that's when you start to consider maybe doing a second session. Yeah. And there is empirical data, in addition to my anecdotal experience, that would suggest that's a better way to do it. One thing anecdotally I did notice, going back to that earlier question, of when I got away from doing full leg days, my systemic recovery was substantially better across the board, and the overall mesocycle RPE, if that's a thing, got lower despite doing a similar amount of work. So I know that leg days are cultural holdovers, and if you need to bring up your legs like I am currently doing, you may need to actually do a leg day. But just be aware of how much it takes out of you psychologically, physically, energetically to do leg press, squats, RDL, lunges, and leg curls all in the same day. That's a lot to ask of your body, a lot more than your other typical bodybuilding splits, and you may be better off splitting that up and thinking about what's going to create less of a recovery sink.
Good call. All right, now there were a lot of questions in here that generally had to do with, I would say, progression of volume, and a lot of questions about set volume. Specifically, when should I go up in sets? If I feel fine but I'm making progress, should I go up in sets? A lot of stuff about how do I progress volume specifically with regards to set volume. And so I was hoping maybe you could just give like a quick overview of the framework for volume progression that you introduced in the hallowed pages of Mass a while ago. You had kind of written an article about it. If you have the outline up, I put that kind of summary figure in the outline so I could follow along. So it's in there. But I think that would probably be the best way to kind of address several questions at once here, which are all on the same theme. And that'll probably wrap up the show for tonight.
Perfect. This will only take me 45 minutes.
Yeah.
Just kidding. It'll take me 4 to 5 minutes. So yeah, I think the take home, because sometimes when I talk about this, it seems like I'm advising against, I'll just be explicit, the Renaissance periodization model of volume progression throughout a mesocycle. But I'm not. I think you can apply these same concepts to that if you are focused on the average set volume that you have over time. Because ultimately, you're going to get to a point in the career of a lifter where you are going to be adjusting variables and trying to chase what is your best guess at optimal to maximize the rate of hypertrophy. And you need to be able to look at data over time and kind of artificially making the focus on the week-to-week microcycle changes is just not representative over the time course that hypertrophy takes. So you can certainly create a microcycle to microcycle adjustment within a mesocycle where you're prospectively and progressively increasing set volume per muscle group, but you need to think about what's the average volume you did over that block, and then assess multiple blocks of training to see, did I actually progress, which is what we're going to get to, and then, okay, if I did, I probably don't know if I need or would benefit from increasing volume, but this is certainly sufficient, and if I'm well trained, it's probably therefore close to the maximum amount of muscle I can gain, because any muscle mass gained over a couple mesocycles is good for an advanced lifter. So there's a potential cost of me doing more volume when I'm already progressing. So my official stance generally is that for late stage intermediates or later, if there is measurable progress that is occurring in the gym on your lifts, reps going up, load going up, or some combination of the two, on the majority of your training, especially if you're doing a specialization cycle and you're focusing on specific muscle groups, that you shouldn't change your average volume. Now, you can use a model where you're keeping volume the same, set volume throughout a mesocycle, and you make the same assessment, or you can have it lower at the start or higher at the end if you prefer. And the way you would assess which one of those is potentially better is, when does that force you to deload? And sometimes with a more aggressive increase in volume, you have to deload more frequently. And that actually lowers the average amount of volume you're doing over multiple mesocycles, because you're escalating so high so quickly that you're getting a disproportionate increase in systemic fatigue, and you're unable to kind of match that volume with subjective markers of recovery, and you have to deload more frequently where you feel like you have to. So that's the thing you want to avoid. You don't want these large upticks. So that's kind of a starting caveat, so people just know I'm not saying never increase volumes week to week. You can set things up, but we really care about average volume over time. The way I see set volume is that is a true increase in volume, but you still can use quote unquote volume load as a marker of when and if you might need to increase set volume. So volume load, or historically what we used to think of as volume, is sets times reps times load. And it's a nice sensitive calculation on an individual lift, which you can compare to that same lift, to where if you add a little bit of load or if you add reps, you can see your volume load go up. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in every set. Maybe you got a few more reps on the first set, and then the same number of reps that you got on the second and third set as last week. And that's going to be an additional multiplicative factor that's going to result in slightly higher volume load. So if your volume load is going up, you know that what you're doing is sufficient to induce overload for performance adaptations. And when you are a bodybuilder or just someone who's primarily interested in aesthetics, it's not that you necessarily care about the fact that you're getting stronger or having better muscular endurance with the same load. It's that of all the mechanisms which can allow you to get more reps or allow you to increase your strength, one of them is increased contractile tissue. And if you're holding steady with good performance of technique, you're maintaining a similar enough RIR, you're not forcing yourself closer and closer to failure to get those performance enhancements, that means something is going on under the hood that probably is either going to lead to or is related to or is indicative or co-varies with hypertrophy. May not be happening right now, but if overload is occurring, and one of the many ways, and actually the dominant way, at least in cross-sectional studies, that is influencing your ability to produce force is cross-sectional area or muscle volume or muscle thickness, however we want to measure it. Those pretty strongly relate to one another, strength and hypertrophy. So in an advanced lifter with stable form and keeping other things constant, if you're getting stronger over enough long period of time, I'm relatively confident, not necessarily 1RM strength on a compound movement, but across the board, that you're probably inducing some gains in muscle tissue. So that's the primary thing you're looking for, is my performance going up? And the reason why I don't like to couple purely some of the things that RP does with whether or not I should increase volume, like, hey, if I can do more volume, I should, is because the technical definition of recovery and resistance training or performance in general in sports science is, can I get back to baseline? And I'll use an anecdotal experience to explain why. So last week, I actually got a minor hamstring tweak on the last set of my RDLs that I did on my leg day. And I was hitting a PR in the 3 sets before that last set. I had 4 sets of RDLs. I train in the 5 to 8 rep range. I'm using a dynamic double progression where I start at 8 RPE and I don't let myself go higher than a 9 RPE, and I just adjust the load so that I fall within those things, and I increase rep or loads as I can. And I was working towards, hey, I think I can get 160 kilos for 4 sets of 8. This time I'm building up. I did 160 for 7, 7, 7. I'm up close to like a 9 RPE. I'm like, let me try it on this last set. My 5th rep on the way down, tweaked my hamstring. Wasn't a full tear. I did some BFR this week. Next week I'll be fine. But a very minor ouchie. And here's the thing. My performance was up. But the question is if I'd done a deload this week, would that have happened? Maybe, maybe not. But I think there's an argument I could make that me deloading would have prevented the minor ouchie, minor injury I got. However, if we were strictly going by a sports science definition of, oh, you only deload when recovery is an issue, so your performance should be regressing. But what we see in the overtraining and overreaching literature on resistance training is it's extremely difficult to overreach or overtrain, defined by this chronic multi-month long period of suppressed performance despite overloading training. And what is far more likely to occur before that are injuries, aches and pains, subjective markers getting worse, motivation to train going down, etc. So I don't base the decision to deload or reduce volume purely based upon performance, because it's not the first wheel to fall off. You're going to get hurt probably before you start to see consistent decrement in strength performance most of the time, as I just evidenced last week, right? So I think it's good to pick a amount of volume based upon training history, where you're going, whether or not you've been progressing, and what is sufficient to result in getting performance increases. But I don't think you need to then keep increasing volume like RP might recommend until you're no longer increasing performance, because you're going to get to a point where other issues crop up before performance starts dropping off because of fatigue. So that's my argument against just prospectively increasing volume kind of quote unquote willy-nilly based upon increased volume until performance stops. And what you want to do is just look at outcomes over time. And you increase set volume when subjective recovery is good or sufficient, right? And you're not making progress. So I feel like I could handle more, and I'm not progressing with this current level of volume. Not, I am progressing with this level of volume, and I maybe feel terrible, or who cares what I feel, because I'm progressing with the level of volume, so maybe I'd benefit from more. Because there's more risk associated with that that'll ultimately sacrifice long-term gains than the prior model.
Beautiful. So you establish your initial set volume, you progress your volume load within that set volume, and then once you feel like you can handle more and you're not making the progress that you're expecting, at that point you go ahead and bump up set volume.
Exactly. And the really important thing I would say is you can have that paradigm with changes in volume week to week, or having it static across mesocycles, just looking at the average. And the only thing I would recommend against, and where I might differ from someone like a Mike Israetel, is that just because you can increase volume without seeing a performance decrement, I don't think you should. Because things like an injury that may or may not have occurred, but I would say are probably more likely when you're doing more, despite the fact that you're improving, is more likely to slow you down than the theoretical better gains you could have made from doing more.
All right. Makes sense. Great answer. Hopefully, I know people in the chat were saying that they're loving it, that we provided some good stuff tonight. I appreciate the feedback. Once again, if you love what we're doing, there's a lot of ways to support our efforts here. And one of the other ways I forgot to mention earlier is you could check out the Mass Research Review. We've mentioned several times during this episode, we've referred back to articles on these topics that we've written in the Mass Research Review. When you subscribe, you actually get access to the entire back catalog, which at this point is, what are we in, volume 8?
We're on our 7th year.
Volume 7? Yeah. So it's many years of just tremendous, article after article, video after video, audio roundtables, the whole deal. So if you were a Mass subscriber who has read the entire libraries, a lot of the stuff would have been review, and you would have enjoyed these evidence-based explanations years ago. So think of everything you've been missing out on by not being a Mass subscriber. It hurts to think about, but you can fix that today by going to massresearchreview.com. As always, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate everyone in the live chat. Really great questions. Be sure to keep them coming. Submit them in the live chats. Use the link in the description. Send those whenever they come up, and we'll be sure to answer as many as we possibly can. So we're signing off here. As always, thanks so much for joining us, and I will see you again in exactly 1 week.